next service that we want to build is called tokens. Tokens are going to be the authentication mechanism for this application. Rather than sending a user's phone number and password with each request in order to authenticate them, we're just going to have them create a token with their phone number and password, and then use that token for any subsequent requests that would require authentication. So let's go ahead and create a token service on the router. Go back to index.js, scroll down, and we're going to add tokens, which is handlers.tokens. And before I forget, within our .data folder, we should also create a tokens subfolder the same way that we did for users here. So I'm going to make the directory data tokens. And that'll be where all the tokens get stored. Okay, now I'm going to go back to handlers, and we have to create a whole bunch of tokens handlers. We want to go about this in the same way that we did for users, where there's going to be a blanket handler that grabs all requests coming into tokens and then checks it against acceptable methods and relays it on to wherever it needs to go. So I'm actually going to copy the handlers users and start the tokens handlers with the same basic scaffolding. So I'm going to rename this tokens, rename it handlers.tokens. It's going to have the same acceptable methods, post, get, put, and delete. And it should, instead of relaying to the user's submethods, it should relay to the token submethods in the same way. Now we need to create all those submethods. So first, let's create a container. Now we can create submethods on this container. We'll go ahead and do post, get, put, and delete. We'll do handlers tokens post equals a function that takes a data and a callback. Now I'm just going to copy this over 3 more times. Change this one to get. Change this one to put. And change this one to delete. So let's go ahead and start building the actual post service. For this one, we're going to say that the required data is going to be phone and password. Because remember, this is a user creating a token that they're going to use subsequently later. And so we do need the phone number and the password in order to create a token for them. The optional data is none. So let's go ahead and parse the phone number and the password the same way that we did in the users handlers. So let's go ahead and just steal it from there, from handlers users post. We want the phone and password the exact same way. So we have the phone and password, and then we want to say if phone and password continue on. Otherwise, we're going to call back an error to the user, call back 400, and tell them that the error is missing required fields. Okay, but if they do have a phone number and a password, then we want to first look up the user who matches that phone number. And then we are going to have to take some more steps to match that user against the password that was sent. But first, we just need to look them up. So we're going to say data read. This time we're reading from the users collection with the phone number provided. And they're going to call back an error and hopefully some user data. If there is not an error and there is user data, we're going to continue. Otherwise, we're going to call back an error to the user, 400, error, could not find the specified user. But if everything was valid, now we have the user's data, and we need to check the password that was sent against the hashed password that's stored. So we need to first hash the password before we can compare it to the string that's stored in the JSON file. So we want to hash the sent password and compare it to the password stored in the user object. So in this case, we want to use pretty much the same logic that we did in post users. Var hash password equals helpers.hash password. I'm going to paste that down here. Now we want to say if hash password equals user data dot hash password. Then we have a match. We have a phone number and a password match. If it doesn't equal that, we got to error out to the user. They cannot create a token unless they provide the right password. So we're going to call back a 400, tell them error, password did not match the specified user's stored password. But if the hash password did match, then we can go ahead and create a new token for that user that they can use for subsequent requests. So we want to say if valid, create a new token with a random name, set expiration date 1 hour in the future. So we want to say that the token ID is helpers.create random string with a length of 20. Now, you don't know what helpers.create random string is yet because we have not created that, but we will come back to that in just a second. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that calling this function gives you a random string of letters and of the length 20, and so that's going to be the ID of the new token that we just created. And we want to say that this expires now plus 1 hour, so 1000 milliseconds times 60 seconds in a minute times 60 minutes in an hour. Now we want to store the new token ID in the expired field as a token object. So the token object that needs to be persisted to disk is going to have 3 keys: phone, which equals phone, ID, which equals the token ID, and expires, which equals the time it expires. So anyone looking at this token can tell which user it's for by looking at phone. It can uniquely identify this token, and it will know when it can no longer be used. And we want to actually store the token. So we're going to call data create. This time we're going to call the tokens collection, and we're going to name this new file the same as token ID. We're going to save the data as token object, and we're going to get back an error. We want to continue on if there is no error. And call back 200 and the token object that we saved. If there is an error, however, we want to call back 500 because it's our fault. So the error equals could not create the new token for some reason. All right, so that's how you post to tokens, but now we have to create this function named create random string. So let's go to the helpers file. And we want to create a function that allows us to create a string of random alphanumeric characters of a given length. That's going to be called helpers.create random string. The only thing it accepts is a string length. Let's go ahead and sanity check the string length when it comes in. So we're going to say that string length should be a number, and it should be greater than 0. Otherwise, we default to false. If it is a string length, we continue. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and return false. But if there is a string length greater than 0, we want to define all the possible characters that could go into a string. We're going to say var possible characters equals, then we're going to just list every letter in the alphabet and 0 through 9. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. And then 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's a whole bunch of characters. And we want to start the string. As an empty string. Now we're going to go through a for loop over and over and over again until we reach our required length and append a random character out of the possible characters string to our new string over and over again until it is a string of random characters of the length that we need. Okay, so we're going to say for I equals 1, I is smaller than string length, I plus plus, get a random character from the possible characters string, and then append this character to the final string. So we're going to say that random character equals something, and then we are going to append that to the string that we've started building. All right, so how do we get a random character? We're going to say that the possible characters char at math.floor math.random times possible characters length. So in other words, we're going to grab a random number in between the first position and the last position of the possible character string, and then we're going to grab the actual character at that position. Now that we have that character, we've appended it to the string, and once we exit that for loop, we're going to return the final string. So return string. All right. Now that that helper exists, the create random string token ID should happen just fine. So let's go ahead and start the app and see if we can use it to create a token for one of the users we created before. All right, I'm going to go back to Postman. I'm going to look at one of the things that I sent before, see which users still exist. We still have a user called 568. When we created that guy, we created him with this phone number and this password. So I'm going to create a new request to localhost 3000 tokens. It's going to be a post with the same phone number and same password, and in theory, this should give me a token back. All right, I got a token back. It expires at this time, it has this ID, and it is for the phone number I asked for. I should be able to do it again and get a different one. You can see it has a different ID and a slightly later expires time. If I sent the wrong password, like I misspelled it and sent it along, I get 400 bad requests. The password did not match the specified user's stored password. But if I fix my error, everything works fine again. And I can keep on creating new tokens for this user as much as I want. If we go back to the tokens folder, we can see that all these tokens now exist on the file system with their different IDs and expires times, and that the name of their files is the same as the IDs. So that is tokens.post. Now we can move on to tokens.get. Tokens get is going to be a fairly simple service, very similar to users get. We're going to say that the required data is just an ID. Optional data is none. The first thing we want to do is check that the ID that they sent is valid. We're going to get the ID from the query string object that the user sent. So I'm going to grab the last time that we grab something off of the query string and really just copy this whole users get function, because the get tokens is going to be similar as well. I want to change phone to ID. So query string object ID equals string, and ID trim length should actually equal 20, because that was the length of the random strings that we created. And then we want to continue on if there is an ID. If there's not an ID, we want to have the same error, missing required fields. Now we want to look up the token, not the user. So data read to the token service, and we identify the file by ID. Error or token data should come back. So if there is no error and there is token data, we'll continue here. Otherwise, we will call back a 404. Here, we don't need to remove any hash password because the token data doesn't include that. We want to call back 200 and the token data. And before I continue on, I just want to fix this typo. It's the tokens collection, not the token, singular. All right, let's start up the app and see if we can get this get to work. All right, now I'm going to go back and look at one of the posts to tokens that I just did, resend it to get a new token ID. Now I'm going to create a new request that does a get to tokens, where the query string equals ID equals that new ID, and send it off, and I get back this new payload. So get seemed to be working fine. If I change the ID so that it is now something that doesn't exist in the file system, we'll get back a 404. Okay. So gets are working fine, and now we can move on to tokens put. Tokens put are going to have two required fields, ID and extend. That'll make more sense once you understand that there's really no reason to send a put to the token service. There's nothing to modify about a token other than its expiration time. But we don't want to allow users to set an arbitrary expiration time, so instead we only allow them to send an extend equals true payload. If they send extend equals true, we will extend the token out to 1 hour from this moment. And there is no other field that they're allowed to update. And so optional data is none. So we want to get two things out of this payload, an ID and extend. We can grab the last time that we got something out of a payload, paste that in here, change this to ID. And again, the length should be 20. And we're going to copy this down and use it as a base for validating the extend. But that should be data payload extend. Type is Boolean. And really the only valid value for data payload extend is true. So it's either that or anything else is falsy. So now we want to say that if there's an ID and extend equals true, then we'll continue on with logic. Otherwise, anything else is a invalid payload. So we want to call back a 400 and say that the error is missing required fields or fields are invalid. For example, if they would have sent extend equals false, that's not a valid payload. The only thing that you can do to extend is send it as true. If they sent ID and extend, then the first thing we want to do is look up the token. So we want to use our same helper as before, data read from the tokens collection based on ID, and it's going to send us back an error and token data. And we want to say that if there is no error and there is token data, let's continue. Otherwise, we're going to call back 400 error specified token does not exist. But if we did get the token data back, the first thing we need to do is check to make sure the token isn't already expired. We only want to let users extend a token that is still currently active. It's a lot like when you're on a web page, and as long as you keep active, it will continue letting you keep your session alive. But as soon as that session dies, there's nothing you can do to reactivate it except logging in again, in our case, getting a whole new token. So as long as they still have an active session, they can send a put to this service to extend their session even further. But once their session is dead, it's dead. There's nothing they can do. So we want to make sure that if token data expires is greater than date now, then we want to continue with the logic. Otherwise, they can't extend it. So we want to say callback 400 error. The token has already expired and cannot be extended. But if everything is fine with the expiration, now we want to set the expiration an hour from now. So token data expires equals date now, then the same thing we did before, 1000 times 60 times 60. Now we need to persist this to disk, so store the new updates, data, update, tokens, collection, identify the file by ID. We're overwriting data with this new token data, and we're expecting back an error. We want to continue on if there is no error and call back 200. Otherwise, we want to call back 500 error could not update the token's expiration. All right, so that is tokens put. Let's try that out and see if we can get it to work. I'm gonna start the app back up. Looks like I have a little error here on line 282. I should have wrapped this in an object, and I didn't. But before we start this up, let's just fix this little typo. Expires as 1s. All right, now let's start this up. Okay, and I'm gonna go back and create a new token using the same user as before. So I've created a token, it ends in T585. If we go to the tokens folder, we can see it right there. It expires in something ending in 8389. Now I'm going to craft a new request. Saying that extend equals true and sending that ID, but this time it's a put. I got a 200 back, and you can see it's a different expiration time. It's a time further in the future. So right now it's 0757. I extend it again. Now it's 3137. So every time I send that, it'll extend it a little bit. Let's kill this server, and now we can do the last method in the token service, which is delete. Delete is going to be similar to users, where the required data is ID, optional data is none. And it's so much like users that we're just going to copy some of the logic from users. Deleting a token would be the same as logging out, basically. So I'm going to copy this from users. Check that the ID is valid. Change phone to ID. The length should equal 20. Continue on if there is an ID. This time look up the token. Data read tokens by ID. If error and data. Data delete tokens by ID. And call back a 200. And modify these messages. But everything else is the same. All right, so let's start it up again and try to delete this token. So I'm just gonna do a GET request first. We can see that this token exists. I'm gonna change this to a delete. We got a 200, which means if I try to do a GET again, it should be a 404, which we see there. And now that is gone. That token no longer exists. So delete is working just fine. But there are a couple to-dos in this file from an earlier lecture, which had to do with authentication. For example, only let authenticated users delete their object, only let them update their object, only let them get their own object. So we need to actually update those functions with a new helper that we can define right now that tokens exist and authentication has the possibility to exist. So we're gonna write a general purpose function here, verify if a given ID is currently valid for a given user. To specify, I mean a given token ID. So we want to take in a token ID and spit back true or false that the token is valid for the user that we're checking against. So we're gonna call this handlers tokens dot verify token. And this will be a function that takes in an ID of a token, the phone number of a user, and a callback. And it should check that this ID of a token works for this phone number. So we first want to look up the token. So data read from tokens based on ID. It's going to give us back an error and token data. We want to continue if there is no error and there is token data. Otherwise, we can call back false. If we're continuing, we want to check that the token is for the given user and has not expired. So we do that by saying if token data.phone equals the phone number provided and token data dot expires is greater than date now, then everything's fine. Call back true. Otherwise, call back false, because either the token is expired or it wasn't for that phone number. So now we have a general purpose function that can compare a token ID to a phone number and see if they match up. So let's go ahead and incorporate that into our functions above. Let's start the first time we used it, which is handlers users get. So I'm going to take out this to do. Remember, this to do said only let an authenticated user access their object. So that's what we're implementing right now. So underneath phone, before looking up the user, I want to do a couple things. I want to get the token from the headers. Since this is a authenticated request, it should be expected that any client sending that request would have included token equals this as a header in that request. And so we can grab the token from there. So var token equals type of data headers token equals string data headers token or false. So in other words, get the token if they sent it and they put it in the headers, otherwise default to false. And now we want to verify that the given token from the headers is valid for the phone number. In other words, the phone number that the user is specifying in the GET request. So we want to say handlers tokens verify token, the function we just created, and we're going to send it the token ID, the phone number, and we're going to expect back the outcome of token is valid. Now we only want to continue on if token is valid. That's where the rest of that logic is going to go. Otherwise, we are going to call back a 403 to the user saying error, missing required token in header, or token is invalid. And then we're going to cut all this stuff and place it within this if. All right, so now the user's GET is an authenticated service. To recap, the way that this is working is the requester is sending a GET request asking for information about this phone number. So what we're doing is we're saying, all right, you want information about this phone number, let's check your token that you're sending. And check that if we look up that token ID, that matches the phone number you're asking about. Because the only way you could have a token whose data references that phone number is if you created that token because you had the phone number and the password of the user. So in other words, we're validating that you are you before we give you information about you. Now we can basically do the same thing in users put. We want to use the same logic of getting the token from the headers. This time we're going to place it down here And we want to use basically the same logic all over again. I'm just going to close this if. And we want that else to call back the same 403 that we did above. Then I'm going to place all of this logic inside of this if. So we're doing the same kind of check that we did above. Now we want to do the same basic thing for users delete. Let me just get rid of this to do because we don't need to do it anymore. So I'm going to copy these two things, getting rid of this to do because that's what we are doing right now. And I'm saying if there is a phone number, then I'm going to start the token validation. Closing this all up. I'm going to grab the same 403 error from above, put that in the bottom of the else, and I'm going to place the rest of this logic inside token is valid. All right, so now we've modified users get, put, and delete so that only a user who has previously created a valid token could do any of those things. Let's go ahead and try that out. Okay, I'm going to go back to creating a token for this user. All right, I got a new token. It has this ID. Now I'm going to try to do a GET request to users with this phone number, and I should get a 403 because I haven't included the token. But when I modify the headers to say the token equals this, that new token I just created, and I send that along, now I'm getting a 200 back and I'm getting all the data. So it looks like the token validation is working fine. All right, so now we can move on to the next lecture.